Howdy, friends. This is Matt Sewell, and you're listening to episode 108 of the Popecast, A History of the Papacy, the only podcast about popes where you'll find non-boring stories on the successors of St. Peter and a reminder that all the world's problems have happened plenty of times before. Our pope this week bears a familiar name to us in the present day, was one half of a powerful alliance between a pope and one of the greatest Western kings to ever live, and even had something in common with the current United States president. Stay tuned to the end to find out what that is. This week on the Popecast, it's Charlemagne's Pope, number 96, Pope St. Leo III. Welcome again to the Popecast. For anyone who's new here, instead of going straight through from St. Peter to Leo XIV, the Popecast jumps around a bit, telling stories of good and bad popes alike, all in an effort to draw out the importance of the papacy, the gravity of the office of Peter, and the inestimable value that the church has brought to Western civilization. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you enjoy the show. Born in Rome, likely around the middle of the 8th century, Leo was in service to the church for many years, ultimately being named Cardinal Priest of Santa Susanna by Pope Adrian I, and also serving as his Vestararius. Hope I didn't butcher that too much. But that was the title given to managers of the medieval Vestiarium, which oversaw papal finances, as well as, interestingly enough, the papal wardrobe. And it occurred to me as I was writing this, it's the same etymological root as the words vestment, as in what priests and bishops wear at Mass, as well as the word investment, which has a monetary connotation. But it's interesting that they have the same root. At any rate, by that point in history, the late 8th century, such a role was a core figure in the papal court. So Leo was almost certainly as close a confidant to Adrian I as any other official would have been. So it should have come as no surprise when he was voted unanimously to replace his old boss immediately following Adrian's death and burial, the day after Christmas, December 26th, 795 AD. The speedy selection, aside from Leo having been the obvious choice, has been speculated as having been done to prevent any undue influence by the Franks or other kingdoms, for that matter, in papal affairs. At any rate, a letter and homage was sent to Charlemagne, the great king of the Franks, to announce the new pope's election. Here, I'll take a quick minute to just kind of zoom us out and give a bit of context for who Charlemagne was. I mean, he's a famous name, but he lived 1,200 years ago, and I don't know how many people know much beyond just the name and that he was a great king, maybe that Leo crowned him. We'll get to that in a minute. But at any rate, here's a bit of context. The Franks were a Germanic tribe from which sprang several iconic defenders of the church, beginning with Clovis in the 5th century, down through the great Charles Martel, who was Charlemagne's grandfather. Charles Martel successfully beat back the invading Islamic Moors in 732 at Poitiers. Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short, yes, that has become his real nickname, unfortunately. Pepin the Short was crowned by the great St. Boniface, the apostle to Germany, and interestingly enough, the founder of the Christmas tree tradition. He was named by Pope Stephen II, Pepin was, as being the only royal line of the Franks, and he was the progenitor of what became known as the Papal States, after driving the Lombards from northern and central Italy in the mid-8th century. And so it's no wonder that Charlemagne, coming from such formidable stock, became the greatest of these Carolingian kings. H.E. Crocker writes in his great book, Triumph, quote, "A strong, handsome, and vigorous military prince, he had all the barbarian virtues, an army and imperial policy unmatched since the days of the Roman legions, and a sword consecrated to the church. It is estimated that he fought more than 50 campaigns from one end of Western Europe to the other, often with the express goal of defeating and converting heathen tribes who would as soon burn a missionary as listen to the gospel. Charlemagne waged campaigns to the east against the Avars, to the north against the Saxons and the Vikings, and to the south, across the Pyrenees against the Moors, a campaign that would later be immortalized in the Song of Roland. His Frankish armies fought throughout Italy, southern Germany, and the islands of the Mediterranean. His goal was that of all warrior kings, conquest, but also conversion of the conquered to the Catholic faith." End quote. Now, there's so much more you can say about Charlemagne, but this is an episode about Leo III, not Charlemagne. Maybe we can do Charlemagne another day. But at any rate, that's the kind of guy that he was. Swashbuckling, tall, dark, and handsome. Maybe tall, light, and handsome. I forget. But you get the idea. Now, it's easy for our modern ears to hear that and scoff or oversimplify, but take the letter which Charlemagne sent back to the newly elected Leo, for instance. And this is from the book The Frankish Church by J.M. Wallace Hadrill. Here's Charlemagne to Leo. Quote, "My task, assisted by the divine piety, is everywhere to defend the Church of Christ abroad by arms against pagan incursions and the devastations of such as break faith, at home by protecting the Church in the spreading of the Catholic faith. Your task, Holy Father, is to raise your hands to God like Moses, to ensure the victory of our arms. Help thus by your prayers to God, ruler and giver of all. The populus Christianus, the Christian population, may always and everywhere have the victory over the enemies of his holy name, and the name of our Lord Jesus Christ resound throughout the world. May your prudence, Holy Father, adhere in every respect to what is laid down in the canons, and ever follow the rules of the Holy Fathers. Let the sanctity of your life and words be a shining example to all men." End quote. Charlemagne, a singular figure of history, though not without his faults, was genuine in his desire to link arm in arm with the Pope of Rome, and was clearly convicted in the high calling that Leo III possessed as Vicar of Christ. A few years into his papacy, whether out of jealousy, ambition, or a misguided thought that only the nobility should ascend to the See of Peter, Leo was actually attacked by a cadre of enemies as he led a procession on April 25th, 799. As he approached the Flaminian Gate, which is now known as the Porta del Popolo in Rome, the Pope was dragged from his horse, thrown to the ground, where his persecutors attempted to gouge out his eyes and cut out his tongue. He was rescued by two of Charlemagne's men and carried off to the monastery of St. Erasmus on the Caelian to recover. It's well documented that Leo III miraculously recovered the use of both his sight and his speech, and it's been immortalized in the epic poem Carolus Magnus et Leo Papa, translated to Charlemagne and Pope Leo, also known as the Paderborn epic. From there, Leo fled over the Alps to Paderborn in the north of modern-day Germany, where Charlemagne had made camp. The libelous accusations had beaten Leo there, unfortunately, but even still, Charlemagne welcomed the Pope graciously, was skeptical of the accusations, knowing what he knew about the Pope, and insisted that the Pope be escorted back to Rome with an army in tow, and also to put his accusers on trial. After being unable to establish the Pope's guilt or their own innocence in a trial in December of 800, the men were convicted and sentenced to death. But Leo, to his great credit, intervened to stay their execution and instead have them exiled permanently. Not long after, on Christmas Day in the year 800, Charlemagne traveled to Rome himself and, kneeling in St. Peter's Basilica in prayer, I don't know if this was planned or not, if Leo just kind of snuck up on him and put the crown on his head. He was actually praying. I think he probably knew what was coming because he was already in Rome. But at any rate, while kneeling in St. Peter's Basilica, Leo III placed a crown upon his head and declared him Holy Roman Emperor. As Dr. Matthew Bunsen writes in the Pope Encyclopedia, quote, "Through this act, Leo established the custom of having all Holy Roman Emperors receive their crowns from the Pope. Leo gave to the papacy a powerful privilege while allying it closely to the Western Roman Empire, thereby ending forever any reliance upon the Byzantines, long the protectors of the Holy See." End quote. So not only had the Pope basically declared that the world was now subject to a single temporal ruler, but practically speaking, he and Charlemagne would be inextricably linked for the remainder of both of their reigns. And all mostly went well, save for the emperor getting out over his skis one time in declaring that the filioque clause, that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and from the Son, is the filioque portion, that should be inserted into the Nicene Creed, and that was always a bugaboo for the East. There was nothing wrong with such a change, technically speaking or theologically speaking, and Charlemagne, in his zeal, to his credit, simply considered it essential to explaining the true faith to those in the Western tribes. But Leo, despite saying that, quote, "it is forbidden not to believe such a great mystery of the faith," nevertheless was hesitant to change a creed that he considered so divinely illuminated from the Council Fathers at Nicaea nearly 5 centuries prior, considering that there were many other items, too, that are necessary for salvation that also don't appear in the creed. Elsewhere in his pontificate, Leo paid particular attention to disputes in England. Laymen were forbidden for being appointed heads of monasteries, for instance. In another case, he excommunicated King Edbert Prane for seizing the throne of Kent, and he restored the Archdiocese of Canterbury's boundaries to those set originally by St. Gregory the Great. Leo also was called to intervene in a rather nasty and prolonged spat. It's unclear whether he actually did intervene before the king's death, but it was between Archbishop Wulfrid and King Cenulf of Mercia. But apparently the latter was so greedy, the king was so greedy, that he went as far as to illicitly speak in the name of the Pope in order to steal gold both from the Archbishop and the nearby monastery of Abingdon. The threat of mortal peril once again returned to the Pope's doorstep years later, and that was only once Charlemagne died in January of 814, but at least this time the Pope was ready for it. He wasn't quite so merciful this time around either. Unclear why that was, but he made sure the chief collaborators were caught and summarily executed this time. Perhaps he felt the need for a show of strength in the absence of his departed collaborator, who can know. A second plot arose shortly thereafter with a group of nobles from Campania set to march on Rome after plundering their own region, no less, but the effort was put down by armies of Leo's allies in the Duke of Spoleto and in Langobardia, the King of Italy. On the home front, Leo III was able to make great use of the generosity of Charlemagne by both providing efficiently to the poor and continuing the long papal tradition of renovating and beautifying historical churches around Rome, in particular decorating his former titular church of Santa Susanna with glorious mosaics, one of which bore his own image until the end of the 16th century. Leo III died on June 12, 816, after a reign of roughly 20 years and 6 months. At the time, he had the fourth longest papacy after St. Peter himself, one of which, oddly enough, was his immediate predecessor, Adrian I, who was in the chair of St. Peter for almost 24 years. And that's particularly wild to think that two men occupied 44-odd years all by themselves, considering the church seemed during that time to need a new pope basically every 5 minutes. And I was trying to think, I was trying to go through the list. Pius IX and Leo XIII occupied the throne for almost 56 years, 57 years, something along those lines. I'd be interested to know if there's any case of consecutive popes who have occupied a longer span. But it's really interesting to think that modern times you would think popes would live longer, but here we have two at the end of the 8th century, beginning of the 9th century, occupying a half century by themselves. But at any rate, Leo III was laid to rest in St. Peter's Basilica, originally in his own tomb, but his relics were later moved into a tomb containing all four of the first popes Leo. So Leo 1, 2, 3, and 4, all of whom actually are saints as well. And he was canonized in 1673 by Pope Clement X. Following the completion of the new St. Peter's Basilica, I forget exactly when it was completed, but it was around that time, 1500s, 1600s was when it was being built. The relics of Pope St. Leo the Great were moved to a chapel dedicated to him, but the four Holy Leos still occupy the same transept, for the lack of a better term. To the left, when you're facing the altar of the chair in St. Peter's in Rome, off to the left, the first transept off to the left of that is kind of the alcove of the Leos. I'm sure there's an actual official name for it, but gorgeous. It's incredible. Leo the Great has this giant marble relief showing the great legend of Leo greeting Attila the Hun at the gates of Rome with Peter and Paul flying out of the heavens with drawn swords. And then off to the left of that is the tombs of Leo II, III, and IV. So to wrap things up for this episode, as Providence would have it, Pope St. Leo III has an amusing connection to our present moment, and we'll see if you can spot it. On the north side of the piazza of the Basilica of St. John Lateran in Rome, right now sits the Triclinium Leoninum. It's a beautiful freestanding apse mosaic depicting on one side Christ giving the keys to Peter and giving a standard to Constantine the Great. And on the other side, it has St. Peter giving the pallium to Leo III, a sign of his authority as Pope, and giving a standard to Charlemagne. The monument was commissioned by Benedict XIV in the 1700s as an homage to a large banquet hall that Leo III constructed alongside the Lateran Basilica, the home of the Pope, the seat of the Pope, in order to provide a space to hold large official banquets. called a triclinium. It was modeled on the rooms of the imperial palace of Constantinople. It was decorated with mosaics and lined with marble. And granted, Leo's is only about half the size of the one currently under construction in Washington, D.C., but isn't history full of surprises nonetheless? All right, so that's it for the story of Pope St. Leo III. One other thing before we go. Posted on Instagram earlier today a request for questions. If anybody would like to have one featured on the show. And today's question comes from our good friend of the show, Raphael Wilkes, one of the, I think one of the longest tenured followers of the Popecast Instagram at the very least. I assume Raphael follows the show. But at any rate, thank you, Raphael, for the question. His question is, what are the lessons we can learn from Lacrimabili Statu, a document written by Pope St. Pius X? Now, I admit, I was not familiar with this encyclical. Is it encyclical? Yeah, I assume so. Yes. I was not familiar with this encyclical when I read this question, but thankfully, documents from the early 20th century were much, much shorter than ones now. I think Dilexit Te that Leo XIV just released was around 20,000 words, and that was short by comparison. He had shortened it from what Pope Francis had it. Pope Francis was, for better or for worse, had gotten to be the most verbose, the longest-winded of recent popes, but John Paul II, Benedict the 16th all wrote book-length encyclicals. And I don't know if it's an unpopular opinion, popular opinion. I don't think that's conducive to, the laity reading those sorts of things. But at any rate, make short encyclicals great again. This one was actually really short. It was only 7 paragraphs long. It's about the title of it is On the Indians of South America. So it was to the archbishops and bishops of Latin America, written in 1912. So South America had been relatively well established to have dioceses and archdioceses, but there were still issues with treatment of the native people in South America. Now, I think lessons to be learned. Most of the world is civilized at this point in 2025, the year of our Lord, 2025. So I'm going to go in a little bit different direction. Paragraph 2 really piqued my attention as I was reading through this. So I'll read this for you here. So paragraph 2 of this from Pius X. The lust of lucre has done much to make the minds of men so barbarous, but something also is due to the nature of the climate and the situation of these regions. For as these places are subjected to burning southern sun, which casts a languor into the veins, and as it were destroys the vigor of virtue, and as they are far removed from the habits of religion and the vigilance of the state, and in a measure even from civil society, it easily comes to pass that those who have not already come there with evil morals soon begin to be corrupted, and then when all bonds of right and duty are broken, they fall away into all hateful vices. Nor in this do they take any pity on the weakness of sex or age, so that we are ashamed to mention the crimes and outrages they commit in seeking out and selling women and children, wherein it may be truly said that they have surpassed the worst examples of pagan iniquity. End quote. Now that's really powerful. I think, the tales from the New World, from the 15th, 16th centuries, while I think embellished in places, are pretty well documented, right? There was myriad abuses that happened at the hands of the settlers. Disease was rampant. Some of that was predictable, some of it was not. And I think the same, apparently, I don't know enough to comment in detail on that. However, what drew my attention to this, what lessons we can learn now, is similar, I think, to the thread of what the point of the Popecast is in general, namely that man is the same. Man suffers from the same problems, this temptation to money, pleasure, power, and honor, as Bishop Barron so often says. The church faces the same sorts of crises in every age. Humanity, in terms of society, faces the same sorts of crises in every age. And so I think the human heart naturally has the same sorts of temptations. It doesn't matter that we're so technologically advanced now. It doesn't matter that we have all sorts of this cheap processed food at our disposal, or cheap entertainment at our disposal, all these sorts of things. Like in a certain sense, maybe that makes it easier to be lazy, for instance, and sit and binge a show. Sure, that's easy now, but people were inclined to laziness in every age, just the same. So I think that first line, the lust of lucre meaning money, the lust after money has done much to make the minds of men so barbarous. That applies directly in this case. He's referring to the treatment of the Indians in South America, but that's a human problem from time immemorial. So, I mean, that's something that, we need to remind ourselves of this lesson. It's like, it's not just an us problem now. It's a problem that man has faced forever, and the Lord has been trying to draw us out of it forever as well. Along with that, there's an analogy I think you can make, or you could think of it as a metaphor in this case, with regard to the human heart, that being like the southern sun, how hot it is, and if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you get so beaten down that you forget what virtue is. If you're not surrounding yourselves with the right people and the right things and the right communities in the right places, virtue just gets beat down naturally. I think there's a lesson there as well. So those would be my two takeaways. Maybe that was a little bit off base from what you expected. Secondarily, obviously, you treat people with Christian charity regardless of what they can do for you, especially if they can't do anything for you. That's another thread that runs through this. I think that's a good lesson. But the one that I pulled out of it the most is just this reminder to ward off the capacity for concupiscence, the capacity for sin in our hearts, and to strive after virtue, and that we have to be intentional in it, because around every corner there's this temptation to go after, again, money, pleasure, power, honor. And I think that's at the heart of what Pius X was writing in this case, again, to the bishops and archbishops of Latin America, but it applies to each of us in every age, and we are not excluded in the year of our Lord, 2025. So thanks, Raphael, again for the question. Follow us on Instagram, send me a DM. Again, subscribe on YouTube if you'd like to leave a comment on the YouTube videos if you'd like to have a question featured in a future episode. Well, that's it for our episode today. We have been broadcasting live on Instagram while we're recording this. Obviously, the Instagram people know that. So thanks to everyone for listening. Wherever you're listening to this podcast, just a reminder that if you like what you hear, please be sure to hit the subscribe button. If you're on YouTube, leave us a comment as well with what you liked most, something you learned. If you're listening on iTunes and Spotify, I believe you can also leave us a comment, at least on Spotify, but please, if you will, leave us a 5-star rating and review. It helps other people find the show. And lastly, if you'd like to support the work we do here and ensure the Popecast is around for many years to come, the best place to do that monetarily is by becoming a paid subscriber over at Today in Papal History. Thank you again abundantly for those of you who have most recently joined. That can be found at popes.substack.com. That's popes, popes.substack.com. And I'll also put that in the description below. Obviously, the show and the newsletter will always be free to readers, but time is very precious. So your gifts in that regard allow for more time to produce the show and to write more posts on these forgotten corners of papal history. Well, that's it for this week. As we head out today, let us ask for the prayers of Pope St. Leo III. And above all, never forget, these are strange times we live in, but they are no stranger than in ages past. Until next time.